All right, welcome everyone to today's webinar. We are also recording this as our first ever live podcast episode of the Fund the People podcast. So welcome to both a live webinar and a live podcast episode. You get to be part of the podcast today, which is really exciting. Today, we're going to be talking about important new research from the Center for Effective Philanthropy about the state of nonprofits and how our current conditions are impacting organizations and their workforce. We have with us Elisha Smith Arrillaga, the Vice President of Research at the Center for Effective Philanthropy. Elisha, thank you for being with us today.
Thanks so much for having me, Rusty.
Before we kick off, I just wanted to share a few important housekeeping notes. So, as I've already said, we are doing this as a live episode of the Fund the People podcast. I'm your host, Rusty Stahl, President and CEO of Fund the People, the national organization focused on increasing investment in the nonprofit workforce. Please do keep yourselves muted and off cam so that we can have the best recording we can. And later in the session, we will have an opportunity for you to come on mic and come on camera if you'd like and ask questions and share your thoughts. So be thinking about that as we go. Of course, you can also use the chat to share your thoughts and comments and questions if you prefer. If you don't already subscribe to the Fund the People podcast, please do. You can find it on Apple Podcasts, on Spotify, or any of the podcast players. It is technically called Fund the People - a podcast with Rusty Stahl. So if you search for that or just Fund the People, you should be able to find it. We are now posting episodes in video on Spotify, so you can watch if you like. Also posting on our YouTube channel. Those are a couple different ways you can watch and listen, of course. We also do have a premium version of the show with extended episodes, bonus content, and a premium sub-podcast called Riverside Reflections, where I offer my own analysis and reflections about what's going on in the sector and the country. And you can join that for just $6 a month on Patreon. So if you go to patreon.com/fundthepeople, you can find that. And there's some things up there for free as well. So check it out. Wanted to also offer two other calls to action this morning, or this afternoon, depending on where you are. One is that we've launched a little campaign we're calling Navigating Away from the Overhead Myth. And this is an opportunity for you to submit your thoughts to Charity Navigator to encourage them to take the overhead ratio out of their formula they use to rate nonprofits on their site. A lot of donors use Charity Navigator and other nonprofit rating sites to decide where to give their money. And the overhead ratio is still part of their 14-point formula. So on this podcast, a couple episodes ago, their CEO committed to exploring what it would take to take the overhead ratio out of their formula and just present the overhead ratio for an organization on its profile page without it actually being part of the rating itself. And so as a step toward progress, we'd like to encourage them to do that. So if you go to the link that we're about to share in the chat, and we'll share it in the show notes as well, that will get you to a LinkedIn post. And from there, you can get to our little Google Doc toolkit to help you leave your comment with Charity Navigator. So thank you for doing that. And if you do it, and you can let us know in the chat here or in the comments on LinkedIn. The other invitation I wanted to offer is that I have a friend here with me who wanted to say hello. This is, they're up for a naming contest. So in the chat, if you have a suggestion for the name for this very cute Fund the People teddy bear, we will also share a picture or a link in the show notes. We do have a merch shop for Fund the People. So if you go to fundthepeople.org and scroll down on the homepage, you can buy not only Fund the People gear, but also Defend Nonprofits, Defend Democracy, your hats, sweatshirts, T-shirts, even teddy bears. The purchases support our work, but they also help you to use your body as a billboard for the message. So encourage you to use that. It's a great hat or shirt to wear to a public display with a group of people out there maybe holding signs, talking about what they believe. I think you get my meaning. So we encourage you to check out the merch shop and use your First Amendment rights to keep your First Amendment rights. I want to also thank Kaylin Brown, who's staffing the Zoom today and organized this event. Thank you, Kaylin. And Johnny Taylor, who's our sound engineer and editor of the Fund the People podcast. So thank both of you. And now let's turn to our conversation for the day. We've had Dr. Smith Arrillaga on the show, I think 3 or 4 times before, because the Center for Effective Philanthropy has done an incredible job of doing this research now annually, even more than annually, to continually update the funding community about the state of the nonprofit sector. And a lot of the research has lifted up issues of the workforce. In fact, over the course of the first report, which I think was 2013, and then the next one, which was 2018, and then I think it started more annually in 2022 or 23. Elisha, you can correct me. I'm not sure I'm getting that right.
That's right. I too am like, wait, was it 22 or 23? It was one of those years. Yes.
One of those years. Yeah, one of those years. They blur together.
Exactly.
But it really has shown that staffing issues are one of the top rated internal challenge that nonprofits face, that nonprofit executive directors have said. Compensation, burnout, recruitment, retention, that cluster of issues is the top challenge facing nonprofits. And that was before the second Trump administration began. And so I think a lot of funders have tried to respond to the burnout part, but not necessarily responded to the compensation, recruitment, and retention matters in a kind of significant fashion. And that, to me, is a major challenge. But now we have a new context for both the staffing issues and the financial issues and the other issues that this research tends to focus on. While staffing was the biggest issue, even when finances looked stable, according to this study in the past, now financial instability and staffing stresses are kind of colliding. And the perspectives of funders and nonprofits are also, depending on how you think about it, either colliding or drifting apart. And so I think we'll get into that today. I think those are some of the important things I'm coming into this conversation thinking about. So now that I've blathered on for a while, let's welcome Dr. Smith Arrillaga, and please share with us some of the headlines from this research.
Yeah, well, thanks, Rusty, so much for having me today. And we just released this report a little over 2 weeks ago, and it comes from data gathered in September and August of last year. And the data that I'll speak mostly about today is from that data collection where we surveyed all foundations in the U.S. that do over $5 million in grant making. And we surveyed a representative sample of nonprofits across the country as well. And then we did 30 interviews with nonprofit leaders and 30 interviews with foundation leaders, both representative of all the geographic regions in the U.S., to try and really get a sense of what the experience was of organizations heading into the fall of last year. And what we learned is that a lot of what you were sharing just now is exactly right, that things were already tough given some of the findings we had, as you mentioned, in some of our previous State of Nonprofits reports. But one of the key findings of the report we released a few weeks ago is that while organizations are facing an increased demand for their services, almost 70% of them are also experiencing decreases in funding from at least one source. So whether that's a decrease in government funding or from foundations or individual donors. And that mix of increase in demand, while at the same time having decreases in funding, just means that, to your point earlier, times are really tough for organizations right now.
Yeah. Do you want to talk about the issue in terms of the spread of perspective between the funders and nonprofits?
Sure. So one of the things we did was ask the same question of nonprofits and of funders. And we asked a series of questions around various things like communication, willingness to take risk. And one of the areas we saw the biggest difference was we asked funders, how well do you think you understand your grantees' challenges? And around 90% of funders responded that they understood the challenges pretty well. While on the other hand, nonprofits reported that number was only around 50%. So almost a 40% discrepancy between how well funders think they're doing at understanding the challenges nonprofits are facing versus how well nonprofits see that. And when we share that data in other venues, the question we often get back is, well, isn't that always the case? Isn't there always a discrepancy between how well funders think they understand what's happening and what's actually happening in nonprofits? And so we looked back at 2014 data where we asked actually that exact same question, and there was almost no difference between funders and nonprofits. And so it strikes me that in this moment where we really need to make sure that funders and nonprofits are understanding each other in terms of like really understanding what's going on in communities, we have this huge gap. And so how can we be able to really solve some of the problems that are happening right now if we have different understandings of what the problems even are?
Right. And I think we have a live poll we're going to do here to invite folks to consider how responsive the people on this webinar right now feel that the funding community is being. I think we've lined it up where we know there are different constituencies on this call. So we've created 3 different options for you to respond to. If you consider yourself a nonprofit staff, question 1, a funder, question 2, and a nonprofit capacity builder or intermediary of some sort, it can answer in question 3.
That poll is live. It looks like we've got about a third of the group. So go ahead and take a few more seconds there.
All right. And for those listening to the podcast, we asked to nonprofits, how responsive do you think the funders you work with are to your organization's current challenges? We asked funders, how responsive do you think your institution is being to the current challenges facing your grantees? And nonprofit capacity builders, based on what you're hearing and seeing, how responsive do funders seem to nonprofit workforce challenges right now? So those are the questions in this poll.
All right. It's kind of calmed down, so I'm going to go ahead and end that poll and share it out.
All right. So let's see. We've got poll 1 on the nonprofit staff. 5% said that their funders are being very responsive. 58% said somewhat responsive. 37% said not very responsive. And 0 said not at all responsive. So by and large, somewhat responsive is the bulk, almost 60%. Funders, how responsive do you think your institution is being to the current challenges facing your grantees? 14% said very responsive. 29% said somewhat responsive. And not very responsive, 57%. And again, 0 on not at all responsive. And then finally, with capacity builders, very responsive. The question was, from what you're hearing, how responsive do funders seem to be to nonprofit workforce challenges right now? 0% very responsive, 55% somewhat responsive, 36% not very responsive, and 9% not at all responsive. Wow. So we thought it'd be interesting to hear from the capacity builders, since you all have a different view of what's happening in the sector beyond your walls with your clients or whoever you're working with. So thoughts on this, Elisha, on these results? How do these line up with your research? Obviously, this is a small non-statistical sample here, non-significant statistically, but significant for this conversation.
Well, I think the interesting thing is in no case did more than 20% of people choose the very responsive category, right? So it seems that unequivocally in alignment with the data that we saw in our survey, that most folks on the call today also think they're not seeing like a high level of response. Parallel to what we're seeing, the context requires, I would argue, a high level of response. And so that's interesting. The other thing I thought that was interesting in this data is that there are actually more funders on the call today who said that their peers, they're not seeing their peers, other funders, as being responsive to grantee challenges. I think that actually parallels some of what we saw when we talked with folks in our interview data, was that there were not an insignificant number of CEOs of foundations we talked to who also, and this is outlined in the last finding of the report, who are also calling on their peers to do more.
Yeah, there's definitely like I don't know what you call it, not an S curve, but I mean, there's definitely some funders who've been really publicly responding, both in terms of moving money and also speaking out and things like that since the beginning. And then some who've took a while, took 6 months, 9 months, but then began. And then there's others who have done things quietly behind the scenes, but not publicly so nobody knows they're doing stuff. And then
Right.
there's others who just, I think, have been taking a wait and see approach this whole time.
Exactly. Yeah, we heard some of that in the interviews too, that there's just a lot of wide variation in how folks are responding. And there's a lot of variation also in people's understanding of like what this moment means for nonprofits, right? So we talked to also not an insignificant number of folks in the interviews on the foundation side, and even in some of the media calls that we've had around the report where we've been asked, well, is this moment really that different for nonprofits than other moments? And what we say is yes, based on the data I mentioned earlier, where we see these huge discrepancies now, but we haven't seen it before. It is a different moment. And the other thing that's different is around more than 50% of the nonprofits that we survey, when we asked about their concern of needing to close their organization or merge with another organization, more than 50% of organizations of nonprofits said that was a concern for them. It just shows the kind of urgency of the moment in which we're operating.
Yeah, I definitely think there's a difference in perception about urgency and level of 5 alarms. Is this 3 alarms,
Right.
5 alarms? I was at an event in the fall where there were a group of funders who spoke to a room full of nonprofits. And I was a speaker before this panel, and I asked people for a show of hands of who had heard of HR 9495, which was, the first bill after the election, which was the threat of enabling the Treasury Secretary to declare any nonprofit a terror supporting organization. And this was a room of like 100 folks, and it was like maybe 5 people raised their hands. So that was one data point. And then the other was the funders were up there kind of talking about they're waiting to see which of their grantees might get a funding cut from like a federal grant. And it just was stark that they were seeing what's happening in that very narrow context of just the funding cuts from federal funding to nonprofits, not all the other dimensions of what's been happening. And then they were waiting to take action until it happened to one of their existing grantees directly. And so to me, it was like those are blinders, maybe intentionally, maybe unintentionally, to everything else that's happening that's impacting nonprofits, whether it's a law, a regulation, a rhetoric and propaganda, a hearing, an executive order, all these things that are impacting the sector, the closing of government agencies. None of those are direct funding cuts to nonprofits, but they're all impacting the sector. So do you see a similar situation when you interview the funders and talk with folks in the field that there's kind of this narrow view of what they should be responding to?
Yeah, I mean, what we see has really varied across funders. I mean, to your point, there are, for instance, in the data that we just gathered, 30% of funders having increased their payout, but 30% is 1/3. It's not the full amount. So I think there's a lot of variability in how people are responding. I think the other thing, to your point, you're so right that this is a moment where we really need to be, to the extent that we can, proactive instead of reactive, right? So waiting for something to happen and then responding could be really harmful. For instance, many of the interviews that we did, some of them were with food banks, and folks talked about just the increased number of individuals they're serving in food banks. And we think about that now, right? And we did this survey before some of the cuts to the food assistance program went into place. So what does it mean when maybe a nonprofit wasn't directly receiving federal funds for the food that they were providing in a local community, but because those larger benefits were cut, that means they're then seeing an influx of more people coming for the services they provide. And so I would argue, do we want to wait until there are more hungry people, or do we want to try and solve that before people are in the line, basically waiting to be served? And my thought would be we want to be as proactive as we can to try and not get to that place instead of waiting for that to happen.
Right. Which brings me to the thought that, there has been this kind of knee-jerk response in a lot of what you hear from funders, and it makes sense, but I'm not sure it's the appropriate emphasis. And for folks watching and listening, if you go to the Center for Effective Philanthropy website, cep.org, and you go to the area for this report, which is called Mounting Pressure, there is a video of the plenary session from the CEP conference last November, where Dr. Smith Arrillaga presented some of the findings and panelists responded. And one of the things that's mentioned there is this response. And so it's the idea that philanthropy doesn't have the money to fill in the gap that's being created by the Trump administration cutting back on all this funding. And the respondent panelists sort of said, like, that's not the right focus that we should be putting out there, because it makes it seem like the work of philanthropic funding is not significant or important in the country. But I think it's the wrong response, because of course that's true. The federal government has a scale of dollars that far dwarfs what philanthropic foundations have. So foundations shouldn't be trying to replace them dollar for dollar, but they could be funding the sector to stand up for itself, to advocate for itself. They could be funding not mergers and closings of grantees, but keeping opening. I don't know what you call it, but there are things that don't cost a lot of money and are strategic investments in advocacy, policy work, infrastructure groups, and all of those things that folks could be funding that help strengthen the sector in the face of this. So I know that came up on the plenary and it's been on my mind. So I imagine you heard some of that in doing this research, and I'm curious what your thoughts are on how funders could be thinking differently about the money that they have to use.
Yeah. I mean, when we ask nonprofit leaders what else besides grant dollars would be helpful in this moment, people had all kinds of ideas and solutions and things that they're already doing that they just need additional support around. Some of the top things that folks mentioned in their responses were the space for or support for new collaborations with either different organizations or community members or partnering with funders. Organizations also talked about needing capacity building supports. And when we asked in the interviews what folks meant by that, it varied a lot. Sometimes it meant having the support of a legal team that they may not have in-house, but being able to access that resource. Sometimes it meant just having space to be able to meet, because now they formed a coalition with several other groups and just needed the space to bring folks together. Sometimes it was organizations were thinking about new streams to try and solve financial issues and to think through, like, well, how do we create a new source of revenue? They needed some outside financial consultant to help think through that or to provide the infrastructure to make that work. So those were some of the things that folks talked about that were beyond the grant dollar that could be really helpful.
Do you have any further thoughts on the difference in the data from past years to this year? Because one of the things on that plenary talked about was, like, we had the COVID crisis and how it impacted nonprofits, but we had the PPP loans that helped keep payroll going throughout that. And we had the vaccines, which made the disease less fatal and basically enabled us to come back to work and come back to each other. And so in this case, we don't have PPP loans coming to help nonprofits or other institutions keep payroll going. And there's, as Joan Gary said on her podcast, Nonprofits Are Messy, she said, no vaccine. There's no vaccine this time. And it seems like things are colliding, right? Where federal agencies are closing, nonprofits are facing these cuts. So need is increasing, and it's just hard to see where the solutions are sometimes as these things kind of collide with each other. So anyway, I was just doom scrolling in my own head here. So my question was supposed to be, how does this round of data compare to the past data?
Well, I would say when we've presented this data, we've gotten a lot of questions around, well, how is this moment different from COVID? Didn't people respond then like they're responding now? And when we look back at the data that we gathered during COVID, the response was actually more rapid. Funders were stepping in quickly. They were reducing reporting requirements. They were having fewer application requirements. And that was happening relatively quickly. And that's been less the case given some of what we were hearing in the interviews. And other data in the conversations we had. And also the thing that's different about this moment is we had an infusion of funds into the sector at that moment, where this moment we actually have, because of the federal cuts, an extraction of funds. So not only are funders moving more slowly, the context is that there's also money being taken out versus poured in.
Yeah. I think a big other difference is that foundation staff and offices also had to shut down just like nonprofits. There's a different situation. I don't think we've ever had a crisis where foundations are being targeted like this themselves and being threatened with investigations, with 10 times the tax on endowment revenue, or being called terror supporting organizations, or those kind of things by the federal government. So I think for me, part of the challenge has been nonprofits being frustrated by the inaction on the foundation side, but not recognizing that foundations have also been under threat and are scared, just like nonprofits are. And foundations are not used to being in that situation.
Yeah, I mean, we talked about that a little bit on the panel at the conference a few months ago. We had Ben Solstice, who's a historian and is at the Urban Institute, give a little bit of historical context to the moment, because this question does keep arising. Like, is it really an existential crisis for the sector? Is this moment really that different for the sector than previous moments? And yes, in the past, there have been nonprofits that have been targeted, right? During the civil rights movement, during other times. But there is not a time in the history of this country where the entire sector itself, both foundations and nonprofits at the same time, have been targeted in the same way all at once. And I think that's the piece that's different, at least as Ben noted in the plenary session, why this moment is unique for the sector versus some of the other moments.
Yeah. And I will just say, and then we'll move on to our next live poll. So get your mouses ready, everyone, that one of the things that frustrated me last year was that a lot of the advice and analysis that was offered to nonprofits was get your own house in order, get your governance and your bylaws, make sure you're following them, get your finances, make sure you can't be targeted or shut down on a technicality. So it was very, I call, rugged nonprofit individualism. Every nonprofit, take care of yourself, batten down the hatches. But the attacks were not on individual organizations. They were on the entire sector. We didn't respond as an entire sector. We responded in this individualistic way. And there were some efforts. The civil rights community came together and signed like a solidarity pledge. A bunch of funders came together and signed a kind of a solidarity pledge. But the nonprofit sector as a whole didn't do that. And I don't know that's what's needed exactly, but we just need mentally, when we respond to these things, we need to respond on behalf of the platform that we all use to assemble and speak and create nonprofits and maintain them, and create foundations and maintain them, because these attacks are not on just individual organizations.
The National Council of Nonprofits has been doing some great work, along with independent sector and others, to try and pull folks together and to testify in some of these public hearings where the administration is attacking nonprofits. But I think you're right, more folks being aware of the campaigns that they're doing and joining into them and supporting that work is super important in this moment.
Yes, you're absolutely right. National Council of Nonprofits has been defending the entire sector. All right, let's do our next live poll. Kaylin, can you pull that up? And I'll tell folks who are listening what it's about. So we wanted to invite those of you on the webinar here to share why in your case that you think it's so hard to respond to all this. What are the limiting factors? So we asked, for nonprofit leaders, what most limits your ability to invest more in staff right now? We asked funders, what most limits your institution's ability to fund staff investments more directly? And if you want to just broaden it from staff investments, it could be just responding to the crisis and supporting grantees through it. And third, nonprofit capacity builders, what barriers do you hear most often when it comes to investing in nonprofit staff right now or responding to the crisis? So those are the categories we offered for responses. I think really came from some of the work we've done in California over the last couple of years and what we heard in our local dialogue sessions with funders and nonprofits and intermediaries.
All right, we've got about half the group, so I'd say give it a few more seconds. I know there's a lot of options to scroll through. Let's see, we have about 65% in, so maybe 2 more seconds. All right, it's slowed down, so I'm going to go ahead and end that poll and share it out for you all.
Thank you. All right. So we have, for the nonprofit leaders on this Zoom, insufficient funding overall was the biggest one at 92%. And then second place was restricted funding at 38%. Third place was administrative burden at 15%. And board expectations or risk aversion came in at 8%. For funders, 100% said competing funding priorities. Wow. And let's see, tied for second is 25% board priorities and 25% lack of clarity about what quote unquote good workforce investment looks like. All right. Thank you for the honesty there. And third, nonprofit capacity builders. What are your barriers? 75% came in at funding restrictions. 63% came in at lack of internal HR infrastructure. And tied for third place at 25% each was cultural resistance inside organizations and board or funder expectations. So very interesting. And we will try to put links to this data in the show notes as well. Although, again, it's not statistically significant. It's just a snapshot of the folks participating in this webinar. Thoughts, Elisha?
Yeah, I mean, this first one, especially where nonprofit leaders said what limits their ability most to invest in staff was insufficient funding overall. That mirrors closely, right, what we're seeing with almost 70% of organizations are experiencing decreases in funding. This aligns a lot to then it would be difficult for them to invest in staff. And then one of the most intriguing things I thought was the second piece of the poll where when funders were asked what limits their ability to fund staff invested more directly, and the overwhelming response by 100%, and we rarely see 100% in any of our surveys, is competing funding priorities. We know, for instance, in the data we gathered, over 70% of funders noted that last year in 2025, they started some sort of emergency response fund to try and just be able to respond to needs that nonprofits were approaching them with over the year. So we know from that data, right, that folks can be flexible and creative and figure out how to move funds when needed. And we also though see from this data here that they're always competing priorities. And I think that's always the case. So it's just, anyway, it's interesting just to see that, some of those highlights there too.
Yeah. So we're going to open it up to folks to invite questions, thoughts, comments. And before we do that, I just want to say that in March, we're going to do another webinar like this and podcast recording session on Thursday, March 12th, 1 to 2:30 Eastern. And we're going to talk about the proposal that Fund the People has put out into the world called staff operating support. So an alternative way of using the money that foundations have to support the grantees they already support, but to redeploy the dollars, if you will, not to general operating support, not to project support, but to staff operating support. And so I'll be sharing what that concept looks like in a little more depth and the 7 key traits of staff operating support as we've defined it. And then we'll have a panel of discussants, foundation, nonprofit, and intermediary actually talking about the concept and how it might work or not work or challenging the idea. So I encourage folks who are on this webinar or listening to the podcast to save the date for Thursday, March 12th, 10 to 11:30 Pacific, 1 to 2:30 Eastern time for a conversation that connects to this in terms of how do we get funders and fundraisers to shift practices so that investing in stabilizing and supporting nonprofit workers is not a competing priority or seen as impossible, but rather part of our job. So just wanted to share that with everyone. All right. So if you have questions for Elisha or me, raise your hand and Kaylin's going to help bring you on.
Okay, I see someone that raised their hand. Cecilia, If you wouldn't mind coming off mute and coming on camera, we'd super appreciate it.
Thank you so much for the invitation. I can definitely come off mute. Coming on camera is a different task just because I'm jet lagged from a 19-hour flight. At any rate, I wanted to kind of break the ice with a question because it's hard to focus just on one, especially with everything that you've provided over the past 49 minutes. And my organization's biggest challenge is that funders are still funding from the top down. And so more money is going to organizations that do the least work. And those larger organizations come into our communities and then give us a percentage. It could be 1%, 5% of what they're receiving from the funder. And so I have done my best over the past year to change that dynamic by calling out these larger organizations and even going to their funders. So my question is, what more can I be doing to change that dynamic?
Well, first of all, thank you for all that you're doing. The first thing I'll say, what you describe is not an uncommon thing that we hear in the data that we collect, and that often for a variety of reasons, which is a whole nother research report in and of itself. But funders use intermediaries to re-grant dollars. And we did a study last year, actually, that focused just on intermediaries and whether they actually meet the goals that funders are hoping. Some of the things that came up in the research we did for the reasons that funders use intermediaries are things like wanting to reach a more diverse group of organizations, wanting to find organizations they don't usually find. But then another reason that comes up is also to try and deflect some of the risk. Like a funder may see a certain group as risky, and then they try and defray some of that risk by using an intermediary to do that funding. And so I would say, actually, what you said you're already doing in terms of going to funders, talking to them directly, saying, hey, we work in this community locally and we know what's happening best. And if it's helpful, using the data that we just shared of 90% of funders think that they understand what's happening in communities, but communities do not agree. But it sounds like your organization knows. And so using that data, continuing to talk to funders and say, we know the community, and funding us directly helps us to do our work most expediently. I think it sounds like your approach is definitely the right one.
Thank you.
Thank you for speaking up, especially after such a long flight. We really appreciate you being here and participating and breaking the ice with a question, and an important one. I just put in the chat the report that I think it's the right report that Elisha referred to, Bridging the Gap, Grantee Perspectives on Intermediary Funders. I would just add that oftentimes I have a lot of love for my philanthropy colleagues, but sometimes it is kind of such a rarefied and elite space. Not to say that people are elitist. There's a difference between being an elitist and being elite, and it's an elite space. And often the people who feel comfortable or privileged enough to go in and ask for money also have that comfort level in elite spaces. And they tend to be the ones who walk in the door and say, I'd like to meet with the president of the foundation or whoever. And sometimes it's as simple as that. And then they may have the brand recognition. They may have, as Elisha was saying, the stability and the gravitas of being a research institution or being this stable, sizable entity that the foundation kind of feels comfortable with. So I think, to me, that's the context in which those groups continue to get the money. And so for more grassroots, mid-size, or small organizations that are not as maybe accustomed to being in the elite spaces, I just think it's important I think foundations should try to find ways out of that ivory tower kind of mentality and approach and get out in the streets and meet people in neighborhoods and not be stuck in the elite space. That is hard. Some try to do it, some don't. But I think folks in the grassroots also need to say, we deserve to be heard and seen and part of the conversation in the elite spaces that need to hear from us and where we need allies. So I think just calling and saying, I'd like a meeting with the president and seeing what happens, because you might get the meeting even though, you didn't expect to. And they may really value hearing your perspective that they didn't even know they were missing. I know it's not easy. It's not as easy as all that, but that's some of my thoughts on how folks can break in. Anybody else want to come on? We have about 5 more minutes. Weigh in the chat if you don't want to come off mic or anything like that. Elisha, while we wait, you have a webinar coming up that the Center for Effective Philanthropy is putting on. Do you want to tell folks about that, who's speaking and when it is and that kind of thing? I know you may not have all that information at your fingertips, but...
Yeah, sure. Well, we're excited next week to host a webinar on Thursday, February 19th. And that webinar is going to highlight some of the results from the report we just released 2.5 weeks ago. We have 3 organizations joining us who are going to be sharing various solutions to this moment that they've been engaging in. So Kathy Cha from the Haas Fund will be joining us, as well as some folks from the Global Fund for Children. And there's also an organization in New Jersey called Men New Jersey that works with food banks across the state, and they'll be joining as well. And so super excited if folks are available and interested for, hopefully you can join us then and hear some of the solutions that those organizations, both funders and nonprofits, have been using during this moment.
Fantastic. So really appreciate you coming on today to do this when you have another webinar coming up soon. So we're excited, and I think that's going to be a really good one. Center for Effective Philanthropy webinars are very well put together. Me and somebody in the chat said that teddy bear should be named Justice. So me and Justice hope to be on as a participant listener on the next CEP webinar about all these issues.
Well, I will look for Justice in the chat.
You got to see if, I don't know if they can type.
Okay.
I don't know. Anyhow, I'm not seeing any more hands up or questions in the chat. I think we'll call it a day here, and we will continue to cover this issue. Folks can check out our podcast. We do have an ongoing series called the Defend Nonprofits, Defend Democracy series. And we do have a playlist of that in Spotify where you can check out just those episodes where we try to feature funders and nonprofits who are responding to the Trump administration's war on charity, as I call it, and who have spoken out. So be sure to check out recent episodes of the podcast that do offer resources and inspiration, and stay tuned to your Fund the People podcast as we continue to cover the issues and support action and partner with groups like the Center for Effective Philanthropy. So Elisha, thank you for being with us today.
Thanks so much for having me, Rusty.
All right. And as we wrap up here, I'll just say, make sure to keep your tank full, take care of yourself, and take care of one another going forward this year. Thank you all for the work you do, and thanks for your time today.